Hello, welcome to Letchworth State Park. My name is Elijah. I'm an environmental educator here in the park. And right now I'm enjoying watching these eastern bluebirds come and go from their nesting box. It's always a treat to find these birds flying around the park. Their bright blue colors, the bright orange chest. It's a wonderful native bird species to find. Maybe you've heard that word before, native. What we're talking about when we say that an animal or a plant is native means it was here before European colonization. So, if a plant or animal was here in North America before the late 1700s, we call it a native species. If that plant or animal showed up after the late 1700s, we call it a non-native species. With our eastern bluebirds, there is a non-native bird that we would call an invasive species that sometimes, unfortunately, can kick these bluebirds out of their home, maybe take over their nest, eat all their food in their home territory. That invasive bird is called the European starling. European starlings are called an invasive species because not only are they not from here, but they also cause some kind of a harm. Maybe you hear people talking about non-native species and invasive species and using those two phrases to talk about the same thing, when really there is a difference. Both non-native and invasive species are not originally from this place, but invasive species take it a step further. An invasive species is a plant or an animal that's not only not originally from this location, but it also causes some kind of harm, maybe to the economy. Thinking about a swarm of insects that flies into a farmer's apple crop, destroys that crop of apples. That farmer can't sell those apples anymore. That hurts the economy. Maybe an invasive plant or animal hurts human health. If you've ever heard of a plant called giant hogweed before, it's a plant that's not from here, and it also releases an oil that if it gets on your skin, can help to cause a really, really bad sunburn. So we call giant hogweed an invasive plant. In the case of the European starling, the harm they cause is to the environment, displacing or kicking out native birds like eastern bluebirds can be very harmful to our native ecosystems. You might be thinking to yourself, how in the world did all of these plants and animals that are not originally from North America, how did they all get here? And that's a great question. For a lot of plants especially, they were brought over from Europe or from Asia because maybe they were a source of food. Maybe they can be used in medicine. In the case of the European starling, there's a pretty funny story. Long ago in the 1800s, there was a doctor in New York City who was a huge fan of the works of William Shakespeare. And he made it his goal to try to bring over from Europe to North America any bird species that was named in any work written by William Shakespeare. The European starlings were released in Central Park in New York City, and from that time in the late 1800s, they have now become the most abundant species of bird in all of North America. That bird, not being from here, causes some harm to our environment. The European starling certainly is, in many places in our continent, is considered an invasive species. So come with me now as we take a closer look at how invasive species can affect the natural ecosystems we find here in Letchworth State Park. But first, I'm going to watch these eastern bluebirds a little bit longer. So I'm standing now in the middle of a huge patch of Japanese barberry. As you may have guessed from the name, Japanese barberry is not from Letchworth State Park originally. It's from Japan, or at least Eastern Asia. And here in Letchworth State Park, we consider Japanese barberry to be an invasive species. It's not from here, and it's causing some harm to our environment. The harm it's causing in Letchworth State Park is that it's completely taking over parts of our forest floor. It's choking out, it's shading out our native shrubs and wildflowers. Take a look at this native black cat raspberry that's being completely taken over by this big Japanese barberry plant. With this barberry, as with any other invasive species, we see a typical 4 characteristic model. The first characteristic of all invasive species is that they are what we call generalists. Maybe they don't care what they eat. In the case of Japanese barberry, they don't care where they live. Japanese barberry lives in many different types of forest. The second characteristic of all invasive species is that they mature quickly. They grow up really fast. And in a relatively short amount of time, they are ready to reproduce, to make more of the species. A third characteristic of all invasive species, including our Japanese barberry here, is that they are what we call prolific breeders, prolific reproducers, which means they multiply very quickly. In the case of Japanese barberry, they make lots and lots of seeds. An invasive animal would have lots and lots of babies. And a fourth characteristic that we see here in Japanese barberry, we see in all invasive species, is that they have very few or no predators at all where they're currently living. Taking a close look at Japanese barberry, you can see all of the thorns growing along the stem. When I think of a big plant like Japanese barberry, I think of a big plant eater that should be the control, keeping this plant from spreading out all over the forest floor. That big plant eater that comes to my mind here in Letchworth State Park would be a white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer not having any incisors on the top of their mouth. They have no top front teeth. They want nothing to do with the thorns of Japanese barberry, so they totally leave it alone. To compound the issue, Japanese barberry is also associated with tick populations. Where we see lots and lots of Japanese barberry growing, very often we tend to find more ticks in that area. Ticks are blood-sucking arachnids. They're related to spiders. They are bad for us humans because they can suck our blood, but also can give us some diseases. Usually the first host of a tick is a small mammal. That small mammal with a tick on their body scurries under the thick cover of this Japanese barberry. That tick eventually climbs off the small mammal, be it a mouse or a chipmunk, whatever it may be. When us humans walk by, that same tick can reach off of the Japanese barberry and get onto us. So for that and many other reasons, we don't really like seeing a lot of Japanese barberry here in Letchworth State Park. We're going to take a short walk down the trail now and find out how those white-tailed deer that aren't eating the Japanese barberry might actually be helping it. So what we've stumbled across here is a little odd to most of our visitors. A fence in the forest. Now what we're looking at here is what we call a deer exclosure plot, excluding the deer, keeping them out. This deer exclosure plot measures 10 meters by 10 meters. It's a square plot of forest that's totally fenced. This fence is designed only to keep out white-tailed deer. We don't mind if chipmunks and squirrels and snakes and rabbits come and go in and out of this fence. We're only trying to keep the deer out because this is a science experiment to see what happens to even a small patch of forest when all you do is remove the white-tailed deer. Now, in a healthy forest, measuring 1 square mile, biologists recommend that that forest will stay healthy with a population of deer around 5 deer. In Letchworth State Park, back in the early 2000s, there was a population density study that was done where they measured how many deer were in certain parts of the park. And in Letchworth State Park, we're dealing with a real big overpopulation. So instead of those maybe 5 deer per square mile in a healthy patch of forest, for every 1 square mile of forest in certain parts of our park here, scientists were finding this many deer. 96 deer per square mile of forest in some of Letchworth State Park. That is way too many deer. If you remember earlier, I mentioned white-tailed deer are big herbivores. They're big plant eaters. And having this many deer in such a small space in certain parts of our park means that they are over-browsing. They're eating too many of our native plants. So let's take a walk inside of our deer exclosure plot to find out what happens to small patches of forest when those deer are not allowed in. So here inside of our deer exclosure plot, our native plants are given a fair chance of growing. Like our little aspen tree here that might eventually grow up to be the nesting home of a yellow-bellied sapsucker. I see a wild raspberry bush that eventually will provide lots of tasty food for the animals of our forest. Down here is a wild geranium that will flower and provide nectar to a lot of our pollinating insects. And right next to me here, I even see a little baby maple tree that eventually will grow up big and strong and provide lots of sap so we can make tasty maple syrup for ourselves to eat. And all of these native plants are given that fair shot of growing because the deer aren't inside this area eating them. If you remember when I was talking about the teeth of white-tailed deer, they do not have incisors on the top of their mouth. They don't have top front teeth. All of these baby native plants are pretty soft, very juicy, real yummy treats for these white-tailed deer. And unlike the Japanese barberry that's covered in teeny tiny little thorns all over its stem, these native plants are very easy to eat. The white-tailed deer are not going to want to press the thorns of Japanese barberry into the roof of their mouth, so they leave the barberry alone and much prefer to nibble on our native plants. Inside of our deer exclosure plot, where deer are not allowed in, all of these native plants are starting to grow and starting to reproduce. But if we look right outside of our deer exclosure plot, when we look at the forest floor, we see almost nothing but Japanese barberry. Outside of the deer exclosure plot, where the deer are allowed to get to, those deer are eating the native plants, removing competition for the Japanese barberry and making it even easier for that Japanese barberry shrub to spread out all over our forest floor. Here in Letchworth State Park, where we have all of this Japanese barberry, an invasive plant that the deer are not eating to control its spread, you, like many other people, might be thinking to yourself, why don't we humans just take care of the problem ourselves? Why don't we get shovels or axes and dig it out or light fire to it and burn all of the Japanese barberry, get it out of Letchworth State Park? Well, unfortunately, the problem is just not that simple to solve. There's a kind of bird. It's called a hooded warbler. Now, hooded warblers spend their winters in Central and South America. Every spring, they fly thousands of miles north to find places like Letchworth State Park to build a nest and raise their young. The hooded warbler prefers to build its nest either on the ground or very close to ground level, always under dense shrubs. Taking a look around me now, where do you think a hooded warbler would want to build its nest? Yeah, that's right underneath this Japanese barberry. If we go through and we remove all of the Japanese barberry from Letchworth State Park, because the deer have been eating all of our native shrubs, unfortunately, us removing the Japanese barberry means there is nowhere for that hooded warbler to nest anymore. So come with me now as we take a short walk to take a look at one more invasive species here in Letchworth State Park. You know, there's really nothing quite as nice as sitting under a big stand of hemlock trees on a really hot day. The eastern hemlock is a wonderful native tree species to have here in Letchworth State Park. This kind of tree likes to grow near its relatives. It likes to grow near other hemlock trees. And together with their dense evergreen shade, a stand of eastern hemlock trees creates underneath themselves what we call a microclimate. What that means is that on a really hot, sunny summer day, it's constantly a little bit cooler underneath these trees. And on a really cold winter day, it's a little bit warmer under that same stand of trees. And we consider the eastern hemlock tree to be what we call a keystone species. What that means is many other species rely on its existence in their ecosystem. There's a couple great examples of that in our area. The first one is a kind of bird. It's called a black-throated green warbler. Now, thinking of the association between a bird and a tree might be a little easy. Many birds nest in trees. The black-throated green warbler nests almost exclusively in eastern hemlock trees. In a single breeding season, one breeding pair of black-throated green warblers, the male and female, and what they're feeding their chicks, together in a single season can take down at least 10,000 caterpillars. So, if we lose these hemlock trees, our black-throated green warblers aren't going to nest here anymore. If those birds aren't living here in the spring and summer, there's not enough control of the caterpillar population. Those caterpillars, meanwhile, are eating all the leaves of our native maple, oaks, and other tree species. They're eating out of control. So if we lose our hemlock trees, we lose the birds, there's too many caterpillars, we might start losing our other native tree species. Another kind of animal that relies on the existence of these eastern hemlock trees is the official state fish of New York. It's the brook trout. Anyone that loves to do any fishing might know that brook trout are cold water fish species. They prefer freshwater streams that usually are flowing underneath hemlock stands. If you remember those microclimates I mentioned, the streams that flow underneath a stand of hemlock trees are usually kept cooler. Those brook trout love to eat the larvae of different bugs, including mosquitoes. So think about this now. We lose our hemlock trees, the streams that flow under those trees will warm up, the brook trout swim out, all of a sudden there's not enough control for mosquito larvae. Those mosquitoes grow up and they start biting us all summer long. Unfortunately for the eastern hemlock tree, there's an invasive insect that is currently attacking this tree species in our area. It's a teeny tiny insect whose name is way bigger than the animal itself. It's called hemlock woolly adelgid. It gets that name because it only affects hemlock trees. It covers itself in a protective woolly coating, and an adelgid is a type of insect similar to an aphid. They suck sap out of plants. And with our eastern hemlock trees, the hemlock woolly adelgid insect is sucking the sap out of these trees and eventually will kill them if they're going untreated. Here in Letchworth State Park, though, we're trying to do something about that problem.
As you're hiking around Letchworth State Park, you might notice something a little odd on the bottom of some of our hemlock trees. It's these small circular metal tags. It almost looks like someone's been going around the park nailing quarters to the bottoms of our trees. But what this metal tag is telling us is that this hemlock tree has been treated for hemlock woolly adelgid. It's gotten some medicine, if you will. Each one of these metal tags has a unique number stamped on it so we can find that same tree that was treated again. There's also two colored lines, a red and a green line, that tell us this tree has received both treatments. The first treatment, the tree uses up immediately to start killing the hemlock woolly adelgid that is attacking it. The second treatment is time released, so it might take the tree 5 to 7 years to use up all of that second treatment. The hemlock woolly adelgid that this tree is treated for, again, is a kind of insect. Insects are cold-blooded, so when the environment around them gets cold, their activity slows way down. Typically, here in the northeastern United States, we should be getting reliably cold winters that will slow the activity of hemlock woolly adelgid seasonally. Unfortunately, due to climate change, we're not getting those consistently cold winters year after year. So what's happening with the hemlock woolly adelgid is they're getting an extra round of breeding. They're able to stay much more active for a lot longer in a calendar year than they otherwise should be with reliably cold winters. But again, here in Letchworth State Park, when we're treating our hemlock trees, we're giving them a fighting chance. Just like here in Letchworth State Park, there's plenty that you can do around your neighborhood to try to manage some of the invasive species that you might find. Here at the Humphrey Nature Center, we've planted native flowers in our butterfly garden to try to help out our native pollinating insects. Maybe at home you could build a bird nest box like this bluebird nest box and set that out around where you live. And be sure to check out your local Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, or PRISM. Here at Letchworth, we work with both the Western New York PRISM as well as the Finger Lakes PRISM. Thank you so much for joining me to learn a little bit about invasive species. And remember that any little thing you can do will help your native plants and animals.